Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to another episode of Thinking and Feeling Libertarian, and today I want to talk about immigration. Okay, so basically this is me reflecting off some news that I heard. I actually haven't read the news article, I've just heard secondhand that apparently Biden, I'm assuming through executive action, unless he's proposing, working through a bill through the Senate, but I'm assuming executive action at this point, is that giving sort of permanent residency status. And again, that's not necessarily U.S. citizenship. We'll get into the whole immigration system in a moment. Basically giving permanent residency status to basically what used to be called dreamers. So these are people who, they weren't born in the United States, so they don't get citizenship status. But they were people who came here undocumented, usually because their parents brought them over like at a very young age. So they literally live their entire lives in the States. So they might as well be a U.S. citizen. They just had no idea that they crossed a line. They never lived in another country. And then also spouses of what I'm assuming are people who may be permanent residents or citizens right now. I'm not quite sure what the exact details on that is. But yeah. Now, bottom line, and so basically I just thought this would be a good time to talk about what I think about immigration, but also sort of like the libertarian perspective on immigration. And the libertarian perspective on immigration is actually a lot less sort of like in a firm spot. Like this, I'm generally going to be very, very permissive when it comes to immigration, just so you know where I'm going to be. But I'm going to try to address sort of all the different sort of tiers of libertarian positions on immigration. I would say at the heart of it, if anyone who's like, well, let's think about it. So there's a couple different ways you can kind of sort of come at this. But bottom line is if let's just kind of go through the different points of view. So I'm going to go through sort of, I guess I'll start off with sort of the more conservative point of view, start with sort of like the limited immigration libertarian point of view. And there's a couple different ways that kind of come to that sort of like limited immigration point of view, which I don't agree with. But I'm not one who's going to say, well, if you believe in X, you must not be a libertarian. I can understand the libertarian, the logic of the argument, even though I disagree with the logic of the argument. I can kind of see how they think they got there. And it usually comes from this. So basically, bottom line is like a lot of libertarians, I would say most libertarians, believe in the concept of property rights. It just kind of naturally kind of makes sense, right? Because if I want to say, my life is my life, makes sense. Okay, if my life is my life, then my body is my property. And there has to be some sort of, the thing is that things are scarce, so there has to be some sort of set of rules for how we determine whose is what. Because if everything is everyone's, then we're constantly going to be fighting for everything. Okay, that's the reason you need property rights. Like property rights, people will be like, well, property rights aren't a real thing, or they'll make all these sort of like abstract arguments against property rights. But at the end of the day, like, if you were alone on an island, you wouldn't need property rights because you're alone on an island. There's no one to dispute you taking anything. Property rights are necessary because we do live in a society. You do live with other people. So there is a necessary for some set of rules to determine determine conflicts. Okay, at the end of the day, when there's a dispute over property, how do you resolve that dispute? Okay, and I think a lot of libertarians, some libertarians start off with the sort of like idea that, hey, what's important is the individual, and they get the property rights from there. Some people start with property rights and be like, well, individuals must be protected because of property rights. So there's sort of different tiers on how people sort of get from point A to point B. Oftentimes will determine sort of like how they prioritize things. Okay, so going from a property standpoint, if you were to think of your land as your property, so you own a house and you own the land around the house, well, you have a right to say, hey, who can be in part of your house? And if someone is on your property that you don't want on your property, you have the right to kick them off. And then if they decide not to leave your property, you have the right to use force to remove them from your property. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean... Now, again, having the right to use force doesn't mean you have the obligation to use force. This is another trap I think a lot of, especially more conservative libertarians fall into, where basically, because they have the right to use force, they kind of jump to that, again, determining sort of what is sort of proper mechanisms doesn't necessarily mean you have an obligation to act to use those mechanisms. Okay, So if someone punches me in the face, yes, I may have the right to retaliate. That would be necessarily self-defense, but I don't necessarily have to. It may not always be wise to. Okay, so in the same sense, I would say probably most times if someone's on my property and I don't want them on my property, it's probably justifiable, and probably wise to remove them. But it may not always be. Okay, there's all sorts of different circumstances, but at the end of the day, you, the property owner, have that choice. Okay, so basically think that, then there's just sort of like, but things get a lot fuzzier when you start thinking about like countries and other types of things, because like, do you think of a country as the collective property of everybody who's a citizen of the country? Okay, so if you think of it that way, then yes, people have a right to remove people from that property, but then there's like the question of should they? Okay, and then so now we can go from there. So the more sort of conservative standpoint, they either believe that economically the country can't support more people, which is a problematic argument, which I'll get into what the problems with that argument is. But basically the arguments will say is they'll say, hey, in an ideal free market, like, or at least I would say the more sympathetic point of view would be say, hey, at least in a free market, yes, the market would work itself out and you'd be able to have more free movement of people. But since you don't have a free market, you don't have necessarily those like self-repairing factors in the economy. They say since the market economy isn't perfect, that you can't have more immigration. And again, the key thing here is not this necessarily. We're not having most people. Well, I'll get back to the whole sort of open borders versus closed borders, because that's not the argument that really people will say those terms, but no one's really having that argument in the practical conversation. And I think that's an important point to come back to. But they'll say, okay, well, since this is, in that case, you need to control immigration. Usually the specific thing aside, with the market economy imperfect in so many ways, they oftentimes focus on welfare, saying, hey, because you have the welfare state, what happens, and the thought process is, well, if you have the welfare state, then you're attracting people who will specifically want to take advantage of welfare, which statistically doesn't necessarily borne out, but whatever. You're going to attract people who primarily want to use welfare. So as long as you have that welfare system, you can't have an open immigration system, because you're going to attract too many people who aren't going to necessarily put in what they take out. And again, on its surface, there's definitely some sort of like, it doesn't sound, like, oh, okay, we'll get rid of the welfare system first, and then we can allow immigration. Reality, politics isn't that simple. Just as much as I'd like it to work that way, it doesn't work that way. Then you have other people who are just like, then you have the people who are not libertarian, but like to use libertarian arguments to justify their pre-existing biases. So they'll use sort of that veneer of property rights. But usually you'll see some discussions of like things like IQ, things like that. So they're really just saying, hey, there's certain people that they just don't like. Or there's just certain people, not enough that they don't like, because they might, again, everyone can probably say, hey, well, I have a friend who is in this group and whatnot. They're like, well, I have at least one friend like that. So it's not an issue of like or dislike. There's a group of people that they think they're better than. And they think that there's this other group that should take priority. And essentially they're framing their beliefs in that. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't like people. You could actually have people you really like and still look down upon them. So, oftentimes, like there's a difference between saying, having sort of problematic views doesn't mean you dislike people. Okay, and just saying, hey, you have people you get along with or you like doesn't change the fact that you might look down on them or think of a category of people as inferior, which is a problematic point of view, because again, you're getting away from individualism, which is a big tenet of libertarianism. Okay, there's a lot of, just everyone's just so different. Generalizing isn't a very useful exercise. Not that, well, I mean, we all generalize to some extent. I'm sure I've generalized already once or twice throughout this, just expressing my opinion. But that's the general idea. Okay? So that's sort of like the more sort of conservative point of view. So that, there's the pieces that are, you can kind of see like, hey, there's this somewhat economic logic, not great, but I can see it. Then there's those who are just couching sort of more problematic views within libertarian logic, but they're not, but they're willing to twist that logic to keep their point of view versus changing their view to remain consistent. And that's honestly, to me, oftentimes the test of how libertarian someone is do they change their argument to keep the same conclusion, or do their conclusions change as they realize the same logical framework doesn't apply the way that they thought it did? And it's hard to measure that without actually having conversations with people, which is why it's most important to just talk to people. Don't assume the worst in people. Don't assume just because someone disagrees with you, and again, even can be problematic and have problematic points of view, and be a jerk, that if you don't have a nuanced conversation with them, that you can't get a better understanding of like how much of a problem they might be. Now, on the other side of point of view, it's like basically libertarians generally believe in free markets, and free markets benefit from more people. Okay, most people look at immigration as, oh, look, there's more labor. So they basically fear the whole like down pressure of wages of labor. Okay, which misses the point, because oftentimes, again, more individuals means you have more, not just more labor, but you also have more consumers who can buy goods, create new industries. Okay, people who come here from other countries, they bring their cultural types of entertainment and norms and cuisines, and these create new businesses, new products that actually employ people and create new profit centers and create new industry. But also some people are like, you're going to have people who are really smart and have just new innovative technical ideas. They're going to create new industries and whatnot. You have innovators. You're going to have people who you're going to have individuals who you're going to be friends with, family with, who bring you rich relationships. They're not just a bunch of inputs and outputs. Like every person who's around has a potential to be, again, an innovator, a producer, a consumer, a friend, a lover, whatever. Okay, so it's much more complicated because, again, everyone's a little bit different. Now, again, could I think of like specific characteristics of people who maybe like, man, yeah, I'd prefer those people not be society. But can I think of do I look at it as like, hey, anyone who's you're either in or you out? No. I can be like, yeah, people who are jerks should not be here because they're jerks. But I don't think we should have like a jerk test per se. So generally, libertarians sort of like in that camp think, okay, hey, more immigration is generally going to be good economically because you're going to have more. And then, if you want to be, also practically for, if you're thinking about the government stability, it's like, yes, technically, more immigration does land. You do end up with like more people paying into taxes to keep systems like Social Security afloat. That should not be the reason you're for immigration, though, but it is a byproduct of it. But just more people have more. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't actual frictions at the border. And this is where things start to conflate, because people will point to like, hey, like there's all these people who are crossing the border illegally. They are trampling people's farms. They're getting into different kind of conflicts there on the border, all sorts of violence on the border. Now, that's not immigration per se. That's black market immigration. And this is very much in line with sort of the libertarian point of view on prohibition, that when you make something illegal, when you make something hard to attain, if it's something that's demanded, people are going to go for it anyways. Okay, and that's going to result in oftentimes organized crime, a lot of violence, a lot of lack of transparency of sort of the size of the issue and things like that. And that's what you're seeing in what's referred to as illegal immigration or black market immigration, is that it's being done sort of through like this veil of organized crime, which also creates all sorts of other problems. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need less immigration, because the reason you have illegal immigration is because you have less immigration. Usually, if people are breaking the law in mass, then you have to question the law. Okay, so for example, I was like and then again, just because there's a law doesn't necessarily mean, it's right. So people can, if you're a conservative listening to this, you can think of like mask mandates in 2020. Like, how many people broke mask mandates? Do you think they should all just be like rounded up and thrown in jail? There are times where you have to sit there and really assess sort of like what the validity of a law is and think a little bit more critically about it. So if a lot of people are immigrating legally, the question is why. So you have to take a look at the immigration system. You always hear people say, hey, people should just go wait in line. But there really isn't a line. There isn't like ideally there would be, right? You just sign up and you say, hey, when my paperwork gets processed, that's when I immigrate. That would make sense if the backlog was because, hey, I'm the 1,000th person in line. They just haven't gotten to me yet. But the way the U.S. immigration system works is that you have certain narrow ways to get in, and if you don't fit into any of those windows, you can't get in. Okay, so basically that includes if you're rich, you can basically buy U.S. equities, invest in U.S. properties. You buy your ticket in. Okay, if you are someone with very particular skills that are hard to find, you got a ticket in. Okay, if you married someone, so again, there's a spousal visa. Okay, if you've watched 90 Day Fiance, you know what that is. There is, there's a few others. You can get temporary work visas. I think I kind of already mentioned that. Then there is asylum. And we're going to come back to asylum because that's a whole other conversation, because that's become sort of the default way in, unfortunately, which is not what it's supposed to be. And then there's a lottery. Basically, there's a certain amount of visas per country, and then they're just chosen kind of randomly. So theoretically, you could have been in line 10 years, and someone who's been in the line 1 year gets picked. Okay, so basically, you could be in the front of the line, theoretically, and still get picked last. So it's kind of not very sensical, the system. Okay, so then what happens? You have a lot of people who abuse asylum. Okay, a lot of people who will claim asylum. There's a lot of people who claim asylum legitimately, and you create these huge backlogs of asylees, and that's part of like what the issue you see now. You have a lot of people who are crowding out of the border, claiming asylum. This creates a huge backlog in the asylum system that takes years and years to work through. But because oftentimes those people don't have any other way to go process. Probably a good chunk of those people are people who have no problem or would be great additions. And again, whether you should be of immigration be based on like how awesome you are is just like, I mean, I think everyone could sleep at night with like a basic background check, and again, I understand background checks are complicated because you don't have the best records when you're talking about people from other countries, but some basic health and background checks, and then if those are good, you move on through. Instead, we have something much, much, much more complicated that gets very much abused. So you have people who are legally crossing, you have people who are abusing the asylum system, but it's, again, the reason why is because the system doesn't offer sort of really reasonable other ways to get in. And the thing is that until you reform that, nothing else gets fixed. Like you can do patchwork, like for example, like what Biden's doing, with Dreamers and stuff like that, which is you kind of eventually have to do. Like you're not going to like round up people who literally have lived here most of their lives, if not all their life, but just born in the wrong place on the wrong day, and then throw them out. That's just not. You're not fixing anything. Okay, if anything, you're making things worse because you're breaking up families. You are taking people who are contributing to their communities out of their communities, causing all sorts of disruptions that don't help anyone, but put a bunch of money in like immigration lawyers' pockets. So you got to address the issue, okay, which is sort of the actual immigration system. The problem is that no one wants to address it because it's a good political wedge. Okay, I mean, you saw what happened. They almost had sort of a bipartisan, not very far from ideal type of reform that was almost going to get through, but literally Trump said no, and they withdrew it so that way you can campaign on politics. And that's just and again, it's not it's specifically a Trump thing. It's just a politics thing. But yeah, no, and I mean, so generally those are the sort of the 2 points of view. And again, you'll have people in the extremes who will say, hey, like everyone should just be let in, or no one should be let in. But honestly, like the practical conversation is not close or open borders. So if you sort of just get into this sort of quick route of saying, hey, oh, you're for open borders or you're for closed borders, you're not going to have a productive conversation. Okay, the question is like from where we are now, should we, one, simplify the immigration system, which again, I think simplification is always the best place to start any conversation because I think everyone can agree that most areas of the U.S. government, whether you think the government should be bigger or smaller, are too complex. And simplification would help move things along and make things a lot more transparent and fair. But then also, should there be more or less immigration and why? Okay. No bill is going to be passed where basically everyone comes in tomorrow. And there's no bill that comes in that everyone doesn't come in tomorrow. But what you can do is change the process. And if you make the process more complicated, you're going to get more legal immigration. If you make the process simpler, you'll probably get less. And for those people who are concerned about security issues, because, people might take advantage of confusion and chaos on the border to sneak in, whether like you're thinking like terrorists, gangs, organized crime, things like that, well, it makes it much harder for them to sneak in if the border is more orderly, which can happen with a simpler system. Okay, where basically those who are trying to get in just fine have a way to do so with a fair, simple, easy to understand process. Okay, and then the only people who really can't use that process. Okay, it's kind of like I think a good example we think of like file sharing. Okay, back when the days of Napster came, everyone basically illegally shared files, right? Should everyone be thrown in jail? No, the problem was, one, the price of buying music. And then once they actually started releasing digital music, the price was still the problem and how complex it was with the DRM and all this stuff. But now with things like Spotify and Tidal and Pandora, it's become so easy to consume music and so cheap to consume music. Okay, so it's making it simple, easy, and equitable that most people don't do file sharing. I don't think I've used a torrent in like over a decade. Okay, it's the same principle with immigration. Like, again, you have to ask yourself sort of like, why is this disruption? But now, like, if you can get rid of a lot of it by just making the system better, and then basically the problem that remains is the problem that you really want to target, because the people who wouldn't be able to use a fair immigration system are going to be the criminals, the terrorists who wouldn't have passed those checks in the first place. And now you're going to have a much cleaner way of being able to identify and see them, because they're not going to have all this confusion to hide behind. So I think like the arguments are pretty compelling economically and security-wise and whatnot for a more permissive immigration status quo. But hopefully, overall, this has helped everyone understand each other better. At the end of the day, all I ask is have nuanced arguments, kind of get into the weeds, challenge your assumptions, and try to understand each other. Okay, so when I have people who I disagree with, I try to understand them. I try to get where they're coming from. And it doesn't necessarily mean you change your mind, but it helps you have a more productive conversation, because you're not looking at the person as just this evil person with these evil points of view. You're looking at them as a person whose experiences and journey has shaped their views to where they are now. And you guys can get to a better understanding to at least disagree from a place of understanding, which actually is the first step actually from anyone to change each other's mind. So I'll see y'all later. Have a great day. This is Alex, the Libertarian. You're listening to Thinking and Feeling Libertarian. Thank you very much.